In an old American home, long before the quiet hum of machines and the sharp scent of modern cleaning products became part of everyday life, the day did not begin with urgency, pressure, or the feeling that something had already fallen out of place, but instead unfolded in a calm, steady rhythm that carried naturally from one morning into the next. As the first light filtered gently through thin curtains and stretched across wooden floors, it revealed a space that already felt settled, not because it had been freshly cleaned in a burst of effort, but because it had been quietly maintained in small, consistent ways that never allowed disorder to take hold in the first place. There was no sense of yesterday lingering in forgotten corners, no clutter waiting to be pushed aside, and no overwhelming need to reset the entire home just to begin again. And if you have ever stepped into a space like that, you already understand that the difference is not only something you see, but something you feel, a kind of lightness and ease that makes everything within the home seem more manageable without requiring extra effort. If that feeling is something you have been trying to recreate, even in a small way, then it becomes worth paying close attention to how these homes were cared for, because what made them feel this way was not intensity or perfection, but a series of simple habits repeated so often that they became almost invisible. The first habit, and perhaps the one that shaped everything that followed, was the simple act of opening the windows every single morning. Not occasionally or only when the air felt heavy, enough, but as a quiet and consistent beginning to the day that allowed the home to reset itself before anything else took place. As the windows were lifted, a cool breeze would pass slowly through the rooms, gently moving the curtains and carrying with it the stillness that had settled overnight. And in doing so, it created a subtle but powerful shift in the atmosphere, one that prevented the air from becoming stagnant and allowed the entire space to feel fresh before any activity had even begun. At a time when homes depended far more on natural airflow than artificial systems, this habit was not simply about comfort, but about maintaining a living environment that never felt closed off or heavy. And by allowing that movement of air to happen every day, the home avoided the kind of buildup that often goes unnoticed until it becomes difficult to reverse. Not long after, the second habit followed in a way that felt just as natural, though it carried its own quiet influence over the entire space. And that was the act of making the bed each morning with steady, unhurried attention rather than rushed perfection. Sheets were pulled into place, blankets were straightened, and pillows were adjusted in a way that required very little time but still created a sense of completion. And while it may seem like a small detail, leaving a bed undone had a way of introducing a subtle disorder into the room that lingered longer than expected. By contrast, making the bed first thing in the morning brought an immediate sense of structure to the space. And that structure had a tendency to extend beyond the bedroom itself, quietly influencing how the rest of the home was treated throughout the day. The third habit, which followed almost seamlessly, focused on the floors, not as an afterthought or a task to be saved for later, but as part of the morning rhythm that prevented small problems from turning into larger ones over time. Instead of waiting until dust and debris became visible, the floors were swept daily with a steady, familiar motion, the kind that did not require urgency or strain, but simply consistency. And by doing this each day, crumbs, dirt, and fine particles were never given the opportunity to settle into corners or along edges where they would become more difficult to remove. This daily attention meant that the home never reached a point where deep cleaning felt necessary just to restore order, because the buildup that leads to that need was quietly prevented before it had a chance to take hold. Closely connected to this was the fourth habit, which often took place just outside the home and carried with it a kind of physical simplicity that modern methods rarely replicate. And that was the regular shaking of rugs to remove the dust that naturally collects over time. Rugs were taken outside, draped over a railing or a line, and shaken firmly until the dust rose into the air and disappeared. And while the action itself was simple, its consistency ensured that layers of dirt never accumulated deeply within the fabric, making it far easier to maintain cleanliness without relying on more complex solutions later. Inside the home, the fifth habit was already unfolding in a way that did not feel separate from daily life, because surfaces were wiped regularly and almost instinctively, not in response to visible mess, but as a way of preventing it from forming in the first place. A cloth, slightly damp, would move across a table after it was used, or along a countertop in the same moment a task was completed. And by handling small messes immediately, nothing was left to sit long enough to harden, spread, or become more difficult to clean. This approach stands in quiet contrast to the way many homes are managed today, where cleaning is often delayed until it becomes obvious. But in these homes, that stage was rarely reached because the need for it was removed through steady attention. By the time breakfast had been prepared and finished, the sixth habit brought a kind of completion to the kitchen that prevented it from ever becoming a source of stress later in the day, and that was the immediate washing of dishes. Rather than allowing plates, utensils, and cookware to gather in the sink with the intention of returning to them later, each item was cleaned, dried, and returned to its place right away, ensuring that the kitchen remained clear and ready for use without interruption. This habit was not driven by strict discipline, but by an understanding of how quickly small delays can turn into larger tasks, because once a few items are left behind, it becomes easier to leave more, and before long, what could have taken minutes begins to feel like something worth avoiding altogether. By handling it immediately, that cycle never had the chance to begin, and the kitchen remained a space of ease rather than accumulation. And by this point in the day, without any sense of urgency or concentrated effort, the home had already reached a state that many people today only achieve after hours of cleaning, not because more had been done, but because nothing had been allowed to build up in the first place. As the day continued to unfold, the home did not shift into a different mode of maintenance, nor did it require a separate block of time dedicated to cleaning, because by this point, the rhythm that had been established in the morning simply carried forward, quietly guiding each small action in a way that kept everything from slipping out of place. The seventh habit revealed itself not as a task, but as a continuation of awareness. It was the practice of handling laundry regularly instead of allowing it to gather unnoticed over time, which meant that clothes were washed in steady intervals rather than saved for a single overwhelming effort at the end of the week. There was an understanding that fabric, when left sitting too long, begins to hold on to more than just dirt, as it absorbs odors, creases more deeply, and becomes heavier to manage both physically and mentally. But by addressing it consistently, laundry never reached the point where it felt like a burden waiting to be tackled. Closely tied to this was the eighth habit, which gave laundry its final sense of completion in a way that modern routines rarely replicate, and that was the act of drying clothes in open air and sunlight, allowing nature itself to take part in the process. The clothes were hung carefully, spaced apart to allow air to move freely between them, while sunlight worked gradually, not only drying the fabric, but refreshing it in a way that left behind a clean, natural scent that could not be recreated artificially. There was patience in this process, but it did not feel slow because it happened alongside the rest of the day. And by the time the clothes were brought back inside, They carried with them a sense of freshness that made the entire home feel lighter. The ninth habit, though simple, had a powerful effect on everything else within the home, and it was the consistent removal of shoes at the door, a practice that required no effort beyond awareness, yet prevented a constant flow of dirt from ever entering the space. This was not enforced through strict reminders or rules, but understood as a natural boundary between the outside world and the inside of the home, where whatever had been collected during the day, dust, moisture, debris, was left behind before crossing that threshold. By maintaining that boundary, the home remained cleaner without requiring additional effort, and the floors, which had already been cared for earlier in the day, stayed that way for longer without interruption. The 10th habit unfolded throughout the day in such a subtle way that it was rarely noticed, yet it played a crucial role in maintaining order, and that was the continuous resetting of spaces in small, quiet moments that prevented disorder from forming. A chair that had been moved slightly out of place would be returned as soon as it was no longer needed. An item that had been used would be placed back where it belonged, and a surface that had been disturbed would be gently cleared in the same moment it was used, creating a flow where nothing remained out of place for long. These actions did not require time set aside for cleaning because they happened within the natural movement of the day, and over time they removed the need for larger efforts to restore order, since that order was never truly lost. From this grew the 11th habit, one that defined the structure of the home more than any other, and that was the understanding that everything within the space had a place where it belonged, not in a rigid or restrictive sense, but in a way that made returning items effortless and intuitive. When something has a clear place, there is no hesitation about where it should go, and no tendency to leave it somewhere temporary. It's because its proper location is already known, and by reinforcing this habit daily, the home avoided the gradual spread of clutter that often begins with uncertainty. This naturally led into the 12th habit, which strengthened the previous one by ensuring that items were returned immediately after use rather than being left for later, a small distinction that made a significant difference over time. It is easy to underestimate how quickly small delays accumulate, because leaving one item out rarely feels important in the moment, but when repeated throughout the day, those small delays begin to reshape the space in subtle ways, making it feel heavier and less organized without any single moment standing out as the cause. By returning things right away, each action was completed fully, and nothing remained unfinished long enough to become part of a larger pattern of disorder. The 13th habit added another layer to the sense of ease, and it came from a quiet awareness of what was owned and what was truly needed, which meant that homes were not filled endlessly with items that served no clear purpose. What was kept had value, not necessarily in cost, but in use. And because of that, everything within the home received attention and care, while unnecessary items were simply not allowed to take up space. This reduced the overall effort required to maintain the home, because there was less to clean, less to organize, and less to manage, creating an environment that felt lighter both physically and mentally. From this grew the 14th habit, it would shape the overall mindset within the home in a way that influenced every other action, and that was the quiet intention of keeping the space ready to receive someone at any time, not in a formal or performative sense, but in a way that reflected care and consistency. There was no need for last-minute adjustments or hurried cleaning before a guest arrived, because the home was already in a state that felt welcoming, and this removed the pressure that often comes from trying to restore order quickly when it has been allowed to slip. And finally, the 15th habit brought attention to the preservation of the home itself, through the regular care of surfaces and materials, particularly wood, which was polished not for appearance alone, but to maintain its condition over time. A cloth would move slowly across the surface, it restoring warmth and depth to the material while preventing wear from building unnoticed. And this act, though simple, extended the life of what was already there, reducing the need for replacement and keeping the home in a state of quiet refinement. By this stage of the day, something had become unmistakably clear, not through effort or instruction, but through the natural outcome of these habits working together. And that was the fact that the home had remained in order without ever requiring a single moment of intense correction. Everything that had been used had been returned. Everything that could have built up had been addressed early, and the space itself reflected a kind of steady care that made it easier to live in, not just easier to clean. As the day began to slow and the light outside softened into the quiet tones of evening, the home did not feel like it had been lived in with effort, but rather cared for in a way that left no visible strain behind. And it was within this calm, settled atmosphere that the final habits revealed themselves, not as separate tasks to be completed, but as extensions of the same steady attention that had shaped everything earlier in the day. The 16th habit could often be seen in the way floors were treated beyond their daily sweeping, where from time to time they were scrubbed carefully by hand, not rushed or forced, but done with a kind of patience that allowed attention to reach into corners, along edges, and into the small spaces that are often overlooked when cleaning becomes hurried. This was not something done out of necessity in response to heavy dirt, but rather as a way of preserving what had already been maintained, ensuring that nothing ever settled deeply enough to require harsh correction later, and because it was done regularly, it never felt like an overwhelming task. The 17th habit was less visible, yet just as important, and it was the continued movement of air throughout the home, not only in the morning when the day began, but carried forward whenever possible, allowing rooms to remain open, connected and free from the kind of stillness that slowly makes a space feel heavy. Windows remained open when weather allowed, doors were left slightly ajar to encourage circulation. And this constant exchange created an environment where freshness was not something that needed to be restored, nay, but something that was quietly maintained without effort. From here, the 18th habit reflected a deeper understanding of simplicity through the use of vinegar as a reliable and effective way to clean surfaces, glass, and areas that required clarity without leaving behind unnecessary residue. There was no collection of specialized products, no confusion about what to use or when, because this single familiar solution had proven itself over time, and its consistent use removed the need for constant change or replacement. The 19th habit followed in much the same spirit, through the use of baking soda as a gentle but effective way to scrub and lift what could not be removed by wiping alone, allowing surfaces to be cleaned thoroughly without causing damage or requiring anything harsh. These methods worked not because they were complex, but because they were understood, practiced, and trusted. And that trust removed the hesitation that often comes with trying to find better or newer solutions. And finally, the 20th habit brought everything back to something even more natural, through the use of sunlight itself as a quiet but powerful tool, where fabrics, bedding, and items that required deeper freshness were placed outside and left to be restored by warmth and light. There was an awareness that the sun did more than simply dry, that it refreshed, brightened, and removed what could not always be seen. And by allowing this process to happen regularly, the home maintained a level of cleanliness that felt deeper than surface alone. By the time evening fully arrived, something became unmistakably clear without needing to be pointed out directly. There had been no moment during the day where cleaning took over everything else, no period where effort became exhausting, and no buildup waiting quietly to be handled later. Instead, there had been a series of small, steady actions, each one completed in its own time, each one preventing the next problem before it could form, and together they created a home that felt calm, ordered, and ready without ever requiring intensity. It becomes easy to assume that homes like this required more time, more discipline, or more effort. But in truth, they required something different, something far more subtle and far more sustainable. They required attention in the present moment. They required the willingness to finish small things before moving on. And most importantly, they relied on the understanding that mess does not appear all at once, but builds slowly in the spaces between actions that are delayed or left incomplete. By closing those gaps again and again throughout the day, the need for large corrections disappeared. There was no cycle of letting things fall apart and then bringing them back together. There was only balance. And within that balance, the home became easier to live in, easier to care for, and easier to return to at the end of the day without feeling the weight of what had been left undone. Even now, those same habits remain within reach, not as something that needs to be adopted all at once, but as small shifts that can be introduced gently, one at a time, allowing the rhythm to rebuild itself naturally. Opening a window in the morning and letting fresh air move through the space, making the bed before stepping away, handling small tasks in the moment instead of allowing them to wait, and returning items to where they belong so that nothing remains unfinished. These are small actions, but together they begin to reshape the entire experience of living in a home. And if, as you've been listening, there was even one of these habits that stood out to you, one that felt simple enough to try yet meaningful enough to make a difference, take a moment to hold on to it and even share it in the comments, because it's often those small choices that create the biggest shift over time. And hearing what stood out to you also helps others notice what they might have missed. And if this way of living, this quieter, more intentional rhythm, is something you want more of, then staying connected here will feel natural, because this is exactly where we continue to explore it, one simple habit at a time, without pressure and without complexity. Because in the end, cleanliness was never something these homes chased at the end of the day. It was something they maintained throughout it, quietly, steadily, and with intention. And once that rhythm begins to return, even in the smallest way, everything else begins to fall into place,